There are more than 1.6 million Indigenous Canadians. Nearly 1 million of them are represented by the Assembly of First Nations. That's a sizable vote up for grabs in this year's election. And AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde is joining us this morning to outline what the AFN wants to see from the candidates going into this election. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I want to start with a topic that created quite a heated argument during the First Leaders debate. That is the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada. For anyone not familiar, it's a set of recommendations and articles that do things like prohibit discrimination. They have articles about land rights and governance and protect Indigenous people from having their laws infringed upon by a particular country. This was put out in 2007. Already 144 nations have signed on. Canada has not. In 2015, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau promised he would implement these recommendations if he was elected. He may have signed on, he may have taken off an objector status, but he has yet to implement them. He is promising to do it in this next election. However, how do you feel about that promise?
Well, again, we call on all parties to make strong commitments to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and use the former bill, Bill C-262, as the bare minimum, and they can build upon that. It was a private member's bill. So if the Liberals get in, they should look at implementing a Liberal bill to implement the UN Declaration. And so they've all made commitments to do that, because the UN Declaration really is, we say it's the path towards reconciliation in Canada. And it has to give, it should be looked at to be legally implemented. So creating a bill is one step forward to doing that. But it's not just the federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments. When I look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, it calls on all levels of government to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's a very important piece of work that has to get done.
Last week, you outlined the importance in climate change. You said it is important to support First Nations expansions in the oil sands. Now, you're also aware that Indigenous communities suffer from what's known as the resource curse, meaning they may live next to areas of high production of mining or of energy, yet they often will live below the poverty line. So what is of greater priority to the AFN? Is it emissions targets or making sure that First Nations communities are able to benefit from the use of natural resources?
Well, I think any kind of economic development initiative has to be viewed and decided on through an environmental lens. And sustainable economic development is key. I've been pushing for continued investments in education, in housing, in water, and infrastructure, because there still exists a huge socio-economic gap between First Nations and the rest of Canadians. That has to be closed, because there's a high social cost to maintaining the status quo. And so that has to be looked at, because we want to make sure that the progress that has been made, that there is momentum to close that gap. And so anything in terms of the resource sector, in terms of major infrastructure projects, has to be looked through an environmental lens. And we've said the number one priority facing all people, not only in Canada but throughout the world, is climate change. And we need to get our strategies and plans and processes structured sooner than later, because we only have one Mother Earth, and I think we've all got to start focusing on that, because everything comes from her.
The Liberals, NDP and Greens have all promised to implement what we were speaking about earlier, which is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Conservatives have yet to make any specific promises. I'm curious, when I look around at our political landscape, Chief, is there room for a specific Indigenous-founded and led party, similar to the Bloc Québécois, that would represent the needs of Indigenous Canadians? Have Indigenous representatives on the floor in the House of Commons?
I think First Nations people have got to get involved in all parties: Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Green Party, NDP. And I've always said we've got to get our people around decision-making tables in the public sector and the private sector. So we've got to flood it all. We need better policies. We need better legislation. We need diverse dialogue and opinion and debate at all decision-making tables. So I believe we've got to get our people involved in all parties, because no matter who gets in terms of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, they're going to be making decisions on behalf of all Canadians, and we've got to influence that. And that's the job at the Assembly of First Nations, is to make sure that whoever gets elected focuses on First Nations priorities, because they're really Canada's priorities. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of building a better country together. And so I think getting First Nations people involved in all parties is one of the ways to go. And we have to keep working together and infiltrating those decision-making bodies that exist right now.
So no to a specific Indigenous-led party?
Well, I don't believe, again, that would ever really form government. So it's government and cabinet that make decisions. we've got to influence whoever gets there. I've always said, as treaty people, we agreed to share the land and resources with everybody in Canada. We have yet to see the treaties honored and implemented according to their spirit and intent. So I'll always say that we have a treaty relationship with the Crown, not any particular party. We don't have a treaty with the Liberals or the Greens or the NDP or the Conservatives. We have a treaty with the Crown. So the honor of the Crown, and the Crown has obligations to implement that treaty. So we got to look at it at a high level. And again, having a First Nations Peoples Party is one step. You can look at that way to represent our interests. But in terms of forming government, because we're only 1 million people, probably be very doubtful.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. We'll have to end our conversation there.
Okay, all the best.
Thanks for watching. If you like this, be sure to subscribe here.
And you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.